Whether you're new to Shadowverse or a veteran waifu collector, you've probably wondered at some point, what is the single worst mechanic in the game? Shadowverse has a plethora of powerful archetype-forming cards, some still the way they were released, most nerfed, and its fair share of completely useless, legitimately harmful effects. Some cards in the game just invoke a strong feeling of, why in the world would I ever play this card? Some of them are fairly obvious, whether they don't even pass the vanilla test, require way too many cards in combination to actually be useful, or are literally detrimental to you winning the game. And it's here, in this last category, where we have the single best one, in my opinion, Archpriestess Layla. Now, before I continue, I need to make a quick comparison that I'm going to base a lot of points on, and that is the Magic the Gathering card, Duran the Siege Tower. The more observant of you will realize that these two cards are basically the same, with a few key differences. First, Duran is half the mana of Layla, and because of dual lands and tribal lands, isn't that hard to play on curve. The second is that Duran forces all creatures to follow this rule, while Layla only puts the curse on your own. And the final isn't even the fault of the cards, but the games themselves. The way combat works in both Magic and Shadowverse makes this effect infinitely more useful in one of them. Magic's combat phase is actually spread into 5 different steps. Declaration of combat, declaration of attackers, declaration of blockers, the damage step, and lastly, the end of combat. Now I know if you don't play Magic, that all of that was very confusing, so let's break it down. The player whose turn it is first declares they're entering combat. They can no longer play most spells in the game or lay any lands, and have decided combat is happening now, and this is the only time in the turn they can do it. Most of the time. They tell you what is attacking, and you now have the choice to determine what is blocking. Blocking an attacking creature results in them fighting one another, and to do so, they deal damage to each other at the same time, equal to their attack value, which is then deducted from the other one's defense. Except when it isn't. This is the point of our buddy Duran, to flip the way combat would work. If he were vanilla and had no effect, then normally combat with an Axe Grinder Giant would result in Duran dealing 0 damage and the Giant dealing 6, which chops our tree. But combat is upside down with Duran, so instead, Duran deals 5 and our Axe Grinder pal deals 4. Duran survives the damage step with 1 health remaining, and our forest-killing giant dies. Our combat step ends, and as we end our turn, we enter the single most important step to this strategy, the cleanup step. As we end our turn, the damage on Duran, and all other creatures for that matter, goes away, and they are fully healed. Now, most of what I just said is basically opposite to how combat in Shadowverse works. First of all, attacking is 100% in favor of the attacker. Outside of war, they decide where and when anything they control attacks, and it's usually your face. The benefit of Layla is easily ignored by your opponent because unlike Duran, she doesn't force your opponent to play by the same rules unless they can be used against you. Remember, because your followers deal damage equal to their health, damage they take effectively lowers their attack, allowing your opponent to force even more favorable trades if they're running damage spells. On top of all that, damage in Shadowverse is permanent. When either of you end your turn, if any damage was done to your followers while Layla was on the board, their attack gets lowered accordingly. Layla ends up acting as a virus, draining the attack of your followers as they lose health, withering them until she's either removed or you simply lose the game. The amount of effort put into making Layla work just about never has a payoff with the way the game functions at its core. In order to actually make use of her, you would need Layla, of course, an early game capable of keeping you and a healthy board alive, lots of disruption, and a fair amount of healing to offset the negative effects trading would have. You jump through so many hoops to make her playable, go to summon her, and realize that in function, Layla is nothing but a 6-mana 6/6 who loses attack equal to damage she takes, and then also puts that effect on every other follower you control. No other card in the game so gracefully makes the game harder to win. No other card in the game actually makes it this much easier for your opponent to beat you. And that brings us all the way back to something I said in the beginning of the video that I'll now repeat for dramatic and comedic effect. Why in the world would I ever play this card? It's simple, really. Layla was created for a certain kind of player. Not one that cares about winning at all costs, but one that cares about winning with style and finesse. Because that's exactly what it takes to win with her. I'm not saying she's always bad for you to play, but most of the time she will actively work against you, and it's in that factor of the card that you're met with a humbling fairness. She isn't a card you can play on curve and immediately amass a giant advantage with no effort. She's the exact opposite. You have to think about when and why you would play her, craft a deck around taking advantage of her, and then actually play out a game with the intention of doing so. And even though she doesn't belong in this game any more than a hot dog does on the menu of a seafood restaurant, she has a certain beauty in her function. Layla exists in an alternate timeline where Shadowverse actually facilitates the mechanics she would need to thrive. One where combat is a little less one-sided, and healing to followers is a follower-given right that they all have access to. Who knows? Maybe long after rotations, Layla will find playability. The possibilities are unlimited.